Alrighty, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Wednesday. I'm going to try to get both of these videos done. I'll see if there's time, but I might end up splitting them. I might end up keeping them one video. We will see. So today, we're going to talk about seed plants. There are two major types. There's Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. So these refer to as cone plants and flowering plants. The key difference that's from ferns, algae, mosses is that these are what's referred to as seed plants. To bring back our fern here, one thing that it has in common with ferns is both of these are vascular, but with a fern, we didn't have a seed. We had our Gametophyte here produce both male and female reproductive organs. After fertilization, the new sporophyte grows out of the Gametophyte into what we know as a fern. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing is just comparing to other types of plants. We basically have the framework. We know about haploid, we know about diploid, we know about gametophyte and sporophyte, so I'm going to be using these terms a lot more fluidly, and we're going to dive right into these two types of plants. So first up, the importance of seeds. A seed is a live plant embryo and its food supply, so you can sort of think like an egg of like a chicken or a bird, where it has its food supply, its protective coating. Additionally, the embryo is diploid, so what's inside the seed is our sporophyte. Now, the first seed plants all descended from a common ancestor, I'll move this up, and do not require standing water for reproduction. So if you remember, as an aside, mosses needed standing water for this, because specifically the sperm would actually swim from one gametophyte to another and needed some sort of liquid in order to move. So it needed some sort of standing water for its reproductive cycle to work. Now, seed plants don't need this because they have a reproductive process that takes place entirely within cones or flowers. And we'll talk about what cones are in a moment. I'm sure we all know what a flower is. The other thing is these plants transfer sperm by a process called pollination, and they protect the embryos in seeds. In all of the previous ones, there was really no protection for these embryos. They either stayed with the gametophyte and grew out of it, like in the case with ferns, or they developed some sort of shell and then grew. There was a little bit less protection. So, next up, cones and flowers. For both of these plants, the sporophyte is dominant. I'll mention it again, but basically everything after ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant thing. So what we think of when we think of like a tree or a flowering plant, that is the sporophyte. The gametophytes grow and mature inside the sporophyte plant. The parts in which the gametophytes exist are called the cones in Gymnosperms or flowers in Angiosperms. So we can sort of think of the cones and the flowers as the reproductive organs of these plants. So pollen, a pollen grain is formed inside a cone or flower, so both flowers and cones have pollen. They contain an entire male gametophyte plant, which will form the sperm. So each grain of pollen, to recap, equals one gametophyte. So it's not sperm on its own, it's actually that second part of the life cycle, and it can create sperm from itself. So the pollen allows the sperm to avoid drying out, and cool shapes allow the pollen to be carried by the wind or animals to the female parts in the cone or flower of another plant. So this process is what we refer to as pollination. And when they say cool shapes, I'll try and pull up some images to share with you, but basically they're designed so they're catching the wind. If you've ever seen certain tree seeds where they have kind of like that wing and they kind of do the helicopter spin, pollen is much the same way, where it's meant to design to be caught by the wind and moved around or stick to animals. So after this process of pollination, fertilization occurs and the first diploid 2-end cell is formed, called the zygote. So we always call this the zygote. The zygote divides a few times, and then it becomes a sporophyte plant embryo. So it can stay dormant for weeks, months, or years, and generally it forms this thing called a seed coat, which protects the embryo from drying out. So once the conditions are right, the embryo grows again, the seed sprouts. So this is the formation of a seed. So then when conditions are right, it can sprout and then grow and photosynthesize on its own. So we're going to talk about Gymnosperms first. So like all plants, they have this alternation of generations. Dominant is the sporophyte. Male and gametophytes are separate, or male and female gametophytes are separate. The pollen cones and seed cones are sporophyte structures. So these, the actual structures around them, are part of the sporophyte plant, but they are what is producing the haploid gametophyte. So they're still the reproductive organs, but they can take on different looks. So the male gametophytes are multicellular, but are very small and are totally inside the pollen grain, and they're made by something called pollen cones. Female gametophytes, which will make eggs, are multicellular and small. They're a little bit bigger than male gametophytes because there's still that sperm and egg size difference. And these are made inside the ovules of seed cones. So to kind of show here, we're looking at, say, like a pine tree. So if you've heard of a pine cone, there's two types. So if we zoom in on one of the branches here, there are two different structures. One of them, the top one, is our female seed cone. And then the smaller one, the kind of brighter orange one, is the male pollen cone. And this is what's responsible for making the pollen. This one makes the egg, which will then turn into the seed after it becomes fertilized. So that's kind of what's happening here. And going back over here, so pollination and fertilization. Pollination, the transfer of pollen to the female cone where the eggs are, allows fertilization to take place without the need for gametes to swim through water. So the pollen delivers sperm to the egg. Now, one of the things, a cone isn't really something that's very attractive for an insect or some other type of pollinating animal to provide. Most of those animals go after flowers, so if we were in class, I'd be asking what is causing this. Most of these are, so pollination is caused by wind, which, if you think about it, is what is causing a lot of people's allergies right about now, because these plants release a whole bunch of pollen and then we have an allergic reaction to them. Flowering plants, which have animals that do the pollinating, don't need to use the wind, so there are much fewer pollen grains in the air at any one time. Alright, next up, development inside seeds. If a pollen grain lands near an ovule, it grows a pollen tube, which contains 2 sperm nuclei. When the pollen tube gets to the female gametophyte, 1 sperm nucleus fertilizes the egg. So this is our fertilization process. This results in a zygote, which will grow into an embryo, which is our new sporophyte plant. Forms a seed coat to protect it, and then, depending on which, the seeds are scattered by the wind, sometimes animals. So again, we have this idea of wind moving the seeds around, or things like animals like squirrels will go into pine cones and take out the seeds and kind of hide them. So I'm realizing we're getting close to 11 minutes here, so I'm going to cut the video off. I'll make the next part right away, but I'll do it in 2 parts. So thanks for watching. If you're still interested, I have another video to add onto this for the next video. As always, take care, stay safe, have a good one.